On the eve of the first death anniversary of Iranian activist Mahsa Amini, supporters of an exiled Iranian opposition group marched in Brussels. Calls were made to overthrow the Iranian government, while the demonstrators waved the flag of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. This is by far the biggest show of opposition to authorities in years. The protests in Iran that happened after the death of Amini on September 16th were met with severe crackdown by authorities. There were more than 500 deaths, including 71 minors, hundreds of injuries and thousands of arrests. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is in Russia, and he has been seen inspecting Russian nuclear-capable strategic bombers and hypersonic missiles. Kim was accompanied by Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. This comes when South Korea and the US expressed concerns regarding Russia's military cooperation with North Korea. According to South Korea, Moscow-Pyongyang cooperation violates UN sanctions against North Korea. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has welcomed the European Union's decision not to further expand the ban on grain exports from Ukraine. Zelensky expressed that this is an example of true unity and trust. Restrictions imposed by the EU in May allowed Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania and Slovakia to ban domestic sales of Ukrainian wheat, maize and sunflower seeds. EU Trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis has said that countries should refrain from unilateral measures against imports of Ukrainian grain. US President Joe Biden is scheduled to meet various world leaders, including Brazilian President Lula da Silva, Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky, and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has said that Biden will discuss a range of issues with the leaders, including climate change, the war in Ukraine, and security. This comes ahead of next week's World Leaders meeting at the United Nations. Former US President Donald Trump attacked fellow Republican presidential candidate Ron DeSantis, calling him a failed candidate. Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis made their cases to evangelical voters who gathered in Washington. Both candidates spoke at a pair of national summits convened by the Concerned Women of America and the Family Research Council, the evangelical advocacy groups that support laws restricting abortion, among other issues. Reports suggest that Trump holds a roughly 35 percentage point lead over DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy among the evangelical Christians.
You guys got a lot of problems out here with your governor is very concerned about what we're doing in Florida, so I figured I had to come by. Thank you. Hello, California.
World leaders will meet at the United Nations next week in the shadow of geopolitical tensions. Russia's war in Ukraine, well into its second year, will again be a focus of the annual gathering in New York. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will be attending in person for the first time since the conflict started. Also high on the agenda this year will be concerns of the global south. Several top-level meetings happening during the General-elect Assembly focus on priorities of developing countries in Africa, Latin America and Asia. The Ukraine war is just one reason for the focus on developing countries.
Next week begins the greatest G of all, the G193.
One American and two Russians have entered the International Space Station. The three astronauts blasted off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan and docked at the station 3 hours later. The trio was supposed to fly to the space station last spring, but their original capsule needed a replacement. Astronauts joined 7 station residents from Denmark and Japan. Three terrorists have been killed in an encounter with security forces in the Baramulla district today. The encounter took place near India's line of control in Uri. The terrorists are believed to have been making an attempt to infiltrate the border from the Pakistani side. This comes amid an ongoing counter-terrorism operation in Jammu and Kashmir's Anantnag district, which has now entered its 4th day. At least 5 people have died after a roof collapsed in India's state of Uttar Pradesh. According to officials, the incident took place in an abandoned railway colony, which was ordered to be evacuated. The reason for the collapse is yet to be ascertained. According to authorities, the remaining houses in the colony are now being checked, and railway authorities will launch an inquiry to vacate the remaining houses. Italy has begun transferring hundreds of migrants to Sicily from its southernmost island of Lampedusa. This comes as the country struggles to cope with an unprecedented number of migrants which are arriving by sea from North Africa. The migrants are being lined up and loaded in buses and vans, heading to the island's ports that will take them to Sicily. From there, they will be sent to migrant processing centers. According to Italy's Interior Ministry, about 118,500 migrant boats have arrived in Italy this year alone. El Salvador celebrated Independence Day with a twist. Thousands of Salvadorans took to the streets to air their grievances against President Nayib Bukele. He has been accused of violating the constitution by seeking a re-election. Bukele, whose first term began in 2019, announced his bid for re-election despite a ban on consecutive terms. Protesters also spoke out against Bukele's security policy, his so-called war against gangs in El Salvador, which has led to more than 66,000 people being imprisoned. The security policy did bring unprecedented popularity, but it is also bringing accusations from NGOs of alleging human rights violations. Drone footage shows a mass grave on the outskirts of the devastated Libyan city of Derna. Reports suggest around 3,000 bodies are believed to be buried in this mass grave. More than 5,000 people are presumed dead, with 3,922 deaths registered in hospitals, and more than 38,000 were displaced in the flood-stricken region. Residents and rescue workers in Derna have been struggling to cope with thousands of corpses that are currently washing up or decaying under rubble. The World Health Organization and other aid groups also urged Libya to stop burying flood victims in mass graves. Haitian workers have constructed a controversial water channel. Volunteers from the Ouana Minthe town near the river continue the construction works of a channel to divert water from the Massacre River. The Dominican Republic closed the border on Friday as the Caribbean nation argues that the channel violates a 1929 treaty. Haiti's government responded that it has a sovereign right to exploit its natural resources, as does the Dominican Republic, in line with the 1929 treaty. The Dominican Republic has tightened the security amid the worsening gang warfare in Haiti, where there are daily reports of kidnappings and sexual violence, deporting tens of thousands who left their country. Many Inkatha Freedom Party supporters gathered at the Zulu prince Mangosuthu Butheleli's hometown as his coffin arrived for burial yesterday. Buthelezi died at the age of 95 after a lengthy hospitalization. The South African President Cyril Ramaphosa announced earlier that Buthelezi will have a funeral with military honors. Buthelezi was the founder of the Inkatha Freedom Party. He served 2 terms as Minister of Home Affairs in the post-apartheid government. Thousands of Muslims in Niger gathered at the country's French military base yesterday for a weekly prayer for the departure of French troops. Tens of thousands of protesters gathered outside the base 2 weeks ago, demanding that its troops, as well as the French ambassador, leave the country. Hundreds have remained there ever since, vowing to occupy the base's front entrance until their demands are met. French President Emmanuel Macron said on Friday that France's ambassador in Niger is being held hostage at the French embassy by the military junta, which seized power back in July. World leaders have kicked off the G77 plus China summit hosted in Cuba's Havana. Nations are pressing for fairer treatment from developed nations regarding international finance and sharing of technology. Cuban president is at the helm of the UN's largest organization this year. He said that 84 million children are at the risk of being out of school by this year, and more than 660 million people are without electricity. The internet as well, along with digital technology. While UN Secretary General said that the world is failing the upcoming developing countries, China is also betting big on the G77 by promising developing nations unwavering support. Mexico City's Zocalo Square became a hub of festivity on the Mexican Independence Day. Thousands of Mexicans convened to echo the spirit of Independence Day with the president's traditional grito or cry. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador gave the cry for independence at the presidential palace balcony with a thundering chant of Viva Mexico. The festivity marked the 213th anniversary of the independence from the New Spain movement. The movement started with the call to arms by rebel priest Miguel Hidalgo. Mexican journalist and UFO enthusiast James Maussan has been granted access to alien bodies which are currently at the center of international controversy. Earlier, Maussan showed 2 tiny bodies housed in wooden cases protected by glass lids. The elongated heads, 3 fingers on each hand and stick-like appearance has captivated the world. NASA questioned why the specimens hadn't been made available for testing. A Mexican scientist, at the request of Reuters, reviewed a series of test results shared by Maussan and concluded that they indicated normal life on Earth. Temperatures soar for parts of eastern Australia as a heat wave kicks in 2 weeks after the end of the country's warmest winter on record. The heat wave, which is expected to last until September 20th, is predicted to reach over 30 degrees in Sydney, which is at least 10 degrees above average. The heat comes just a day before the Sydney Marathon. Worried about the impact of the weather and the poor air quality from hazard reduction burns on 42,000 patients and participants, fire danger warnings for Sydney and its surrounding areas have also been increased to high. Canadians are preparing for the arrival of Hurricane Lee. Residents can be seen reinforcing power lines and removing boats from the harbour. Hurricane Lee is expected to bring drenching rain, powerful winds and life-threatening storm. According to the Canadian Hurricane Centre, the Hurricane Lee is expected to weaken into a strong tropical storm before making landfall in the southwestern province of Nova Scotia. Volunteers in Manila are celebrating International Coastal Cleanup Day today. Filipino activists have picked up more than 50 sacks of plastic waste. The trash mostly has single-use plastic containers and sachets. International Coastal Cleanup Day is a global event and it is held annually to raise the awareness about this issue. The day becomes important, especially for Philippines, as it attributes over 36% of plastic waste in the ocean. According to some reports, the Philippines is the planet's worst polluter when it comes to releasing plastic waste. On Friday, Sweden rejoiced with gun salutes, speeches and a lavish dinner as King Carl Gustaf celebrated 50 years on the throne. The king marked the feat with ceremonies across the capital. Swedes were invited to the Stockholm Palace to congratulate him. This was the culmination of a 4-day celebration. The king is the Nordic country's longest sitting monarch. Support for the Swedish monarchy has risen over the years. Meanwhile, in New York, more than 1,000 drones are lighting up the sky. These drones can be seen forming images of the Amazonian wildlife, and they are shining to raise awareness about the climate crisis. The event comes ahead of the WION Summit on Sustainable Development and the New York City Climate Week. The British government is injecting $621 million into Tata Steel to accelerate its decarbonisation efforts at its Welsh site. The UK's Business and Trade Minister has said that this agreement aligns with the best interests of both the United Kingdom and the labour force as a whole. Out of the total funding of $1.5 billion, $929 million will be allocated by Tata Steel to transition from coal-based production methods to eco-friendly electric arc furnaces. The transition, while reducing emissions, could potentially result in up to 3,000 job losses, as electric furnaces are inherently less labour-intensive. US stocks ended sharply lower on Friday as chipmakers dropped on concerns about weak consumer demand. Meanwhile, rising treasury yields pressured Amazon and other mega-cap growth companies. Stoking worries over the chip demand from automakers, the United Auto Workers Union launched simultaneous strikes at factories of General Motors, Ford and Chrysler parent Stellantis. Pakistan's caretaker government has raised petrol and diesel prices on the back of rising international oil prices. The price of petrol has risen by 26 Pakistani rupees, while that of diesel has been hiked by 17 Pakistani rupees. Petrol now stands at over 335 Pakistani rupees per litre and diesel at over 329 Pakistani rupees. The price rise comes on the heels of an already massive hike on September the 1st. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.